Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to St Paul's Cathedral. My name is Andrew Tremlett, I'm the Dean of St Paul's, and it's an absolute delight and pleasure to be welcoming you here this evening. And now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to you Alan Packwood, a Fellow of Churchill College at the University of Cambridge, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Alan is the director of the Churchill Archive Centre and has dedicated his career to preserving and illuminating history. He was awarded an OBE for services to archives and scholarship in the 2016 Queen's Birthday Honours. Alan has lectured extensively on Sir Winston Churchill, both in the UK and in the US, and has written several books, including How Churchill Waged War, published in 2018, and his latest book, Churchill's D-Day, co-authored with General Lord Dannatt and published for the 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord in June of last year. The Churchill Archive Centre is located in the grounds of Churchill College in Cambridge and is home to the papers not only of Sir Winston Churchill, but also Baroness Thatcher, Sir John Major, and almost 700 of their contemporaries, politicians, diplomats, civil servants, military leaders, and scientists in the modern era. It is still collecting, and Alan jokes that it's the equivalent of 4 American presidential libraries. I'm wondering on this state visit what the library will be. Our warmest welcome to him, and thanks for coming to St Paul's this evening. Please would you join me in welcoming Alan. Great.
Well, Dean, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and also an enormous thanks to your team, to Paula, Jen, Emma, Chris, Rosie, all the people who've looked after me since I rolled up at about 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's helped prepare me for the daunting experience of speaking against this spectacular backdrop. Because, of course, this evening I have the interesting task of trying to tell you something new about one of the most written about figures of the 20th century. Sir Winston Churchill's archive, which I'm lucky enough to look after in Cambridge, as you've just heard, comprises some 2,500 boxes. And his official biography has been published in 8 volumes with no less than 23 companion volumes of documents. And as you all know, he continues to be regularly referenced in the press and remains an iconic and often debated figure some 61 years after his death. Few 20th century prime ministers survive beyond the groves of academe. He's certainly one of them. And what makes it even worse for me this evening is that I'm talking about his connection with one of London's best known and most written about landmarks, this beautiful and inspiring cathedral. So I hope what I'm going to be able to do is to bring some small new perspectives, and at the very least, I can promise to revisit some great moments. So before I get too daunted by the task, let's plunge right in. And in keeping with the sort of overall theme of the anniversaries, let's start 85 years ago in 1940. In the early hours of Thursday, October the 10th, 1940, German bombers struck once again at the heart of London, as they'd been doing every night for the previous month. This time, a high explosive bomb plunged through the roof of St Paul's, exploding just above the high altar, tearing a hole in the vault, and destroying the altar table. The cathedral was rocked, but remained standing and did not burn. The watch, commemorated in that wonderful exhibition you've got outside, played their role. Just a few days later, on Monday, October the 14th, 1940, it was the turn of 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was dining in the garden room of number 10 with 3 of his ministers, Archibald Sinclair, Oliver Littleton, and Moore Brabazon, when the bombs started to fall nearby. And Churchill, in his History of the Second World War, described what happened next. He wrote, "The steel shutters had been closed. Several loud explosions occurred around us at no great distance, and presently a bomb fell, perhaps 100 yards away, on the Horse Guards parade, making a great deal of noise. Suddenly, I had a providential impulse. The kitchen at number 10 Downing Street is lofty and spacious and looks out through a large plate glass window about 25 feet high. The butler and the parlourmaid continued to serve the dinner with complete detachment, but I became acutely aware of this big window behind which Mrs. Landermere, the cook, and the kitchen maid, never turning a hair, were at work. I got up abruptly, went into the kitchen, told the butler to put the dinner on the hot plate in the dining room, and ordered the cook and the other servants into the shelter, such as it was. I'd been seated again at table only about 3 minutes when a really very loud crash, close at hand, and a violent shock showed that the house had been struck. My detective came into the room and said much damage had been done. The kitchen, the pantry, and the offices on the Treasury side were shattered. Upon describing his inspection of the damage, Churchill added poignantly that the big plate glass window had been hurled in fragments across the room and would, of course, have cut its occupants, if there had been any, to pieces. It seemed a providential moment, but not everyone, of course, was so lucky. One of Churchill's 3 dinner guests that night, Moore Brabazon, the Minister for Transport, wrote to him the next day, thanking him for a lovely dinner, bomb and all. But he also enclosed a copy of the report describing the destruction of a block of flats in Stoke Newington. Many of the occupants had been in the basement shelters, and it was feared that 200 people had been buried, with little chance of their being rescued alive. And the letter then goes on to mention that Moore Brabazon was off to Balham to inspect the site of the most tragic of all our tube disasters, because over 60 people had been drowned when a bus had crashed into a bomb crater, rupturing water and sewage pipes and flooding the station below. October 1940 was the very height of the bombardment. Jock Colville was one of Churchill's private secretaries. His diary, which we have in the Churchill Archive Centre for October the 16th, summarises the devastation at this time. He writes, "I returned from Cambridge to London, which has been very heavily raided and has suffered severely during the last 2 nights. Leicester Square is a desert. Pall Mall is badly damaged. The Carlton has collapsed and the Travellers was hit. And a bomb just missed number 10, doing great damage to the Treasury and wrecking some of the rooms in number 10 itself. Coming into Liverpool Street by train, I saw such devastation by the railway line as is impossible to describe. Poor London." Both St Paul's and Churchill in October 1940 survived near misses. The destruction of either would have been a grievous blow to British morale and the reeling capital's will to resist. Winston Churchill, though not a conventionally religious man, as we will see, was a believer in destiny, especially his own, and was wont to see the hand of providence in such deliverances. A master of the English language, he was able to utilize religious imagery when articulating the national response to this terrible crisis. In response to the beginning of the Blitz, he broadcast to the nation on the 11th of September 1940. And he said, "It is with devout but sure confidence that I say, let God defend the right." And that speech goes on, "These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes, by killing large numbers of civilians, women and children, that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city and make them a burden and an anxiety to the government, and thus distract our attention unduly from the ferocious onslaught he is preparing. Little does he know the spirit of the British nation, or the tough fibre of the Londoners whose forebears played a leading part in the establishment of parliamentary institutions and who have been bred to value freedom far above their lives. This wicked man, the repository and embodiment of many forms of soul-destroying hatred, this monstrous product of former wrongs and shame, has now resolved to try and break our famous island race by a process of indiscriminate slaughter and destruction. What he has done is to kindle a fire in British hearts, here and all over the world, which will glow long after all traces of the conflagration he has caused in London have been removed. He has lighted a fire which will burn with steady and consuming flame until the last vestiges of Nazi tyranny have been burnt out of Europe, and until the old world and the new world, meaning the United States, can join hands to rebuild the temples of man's freedom and man's honor upon foundations which will not soon or easily be overthrown. I think you'll agree, incredibly powerful words. Such speeches were actually very carefully crafted. The way Churchill would work is that he would dictate. There would be a duty secretary in the room with a state-of-the-art silent typewriter setting down his words. And they would produce the first draft in normal typescript, double-spaced. Churchill would then go through making revisions, annotations, amendments, often in his Churchillian red pen. And the speech might then go through several further drafts, which, of course, from the point of view of the archives, is wonderful, because it's giving you a real insight into Churchill's thought processes. You can look at what he's changing, and you can guess at the reasons why. But then, when the speech is more or less in its final form, it's taken away again by the duty secretary, who types it out afresh at this sort of size, A5 sort of size, so that the notes will fit comfortably into his hand or into his pocket. They're tagged together, but they're also set out on the page, and this I think is something very unique to Churchill, set out on the page in a blank verse format, like poetry. And when you see them on the page like that, you can see immediately why he's done it. Because what those notes do is to give Churchill the rhythm, the emphasis, and the pauses for his speech. His office called these final notes speech form, but others referred to them as psalm form, because they looked like pages from the book of Psalms. Yes, he was a great orator, but not a spontaneous one. He prepared extremely thoroughly, and he really was first and foremost a writer. Indeed, when I was listening to that wonderful sermon a few minutes ago, it reminded me that amongst the notes and drafts that we have are the notes for the finest hour speech of the 18th of June, 1940, the speech that Churchill had to deliver just after the fall of France. He delivered it in the House of Commons and then broadcast it over the BBC that evening. And as you heard in that sermon, the penultimate page of that speech ends, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." And Churchill has added onto those speaking notes in his red pen, presumably at the last moment, perhaps while waiting to speak in the House of Commons, "All shall be restored." In fact, Churchill had always supported himself with his pen. As a young soldier, 1895 to 1900, he'd written up his military adventures as newspaper articles and books. As a member of Parliament from 1900, he'd continued to do the same, maintaining his lifestyle and raising his profile with multi-volume publications about his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, about his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and about the First World War. He knew the power of words. He also knew the power of imagery, Hence the omnipresent cigar, the famous V for victory salute, and his one-piece tailored siren suit, a sort of proto-onesie. And one of the defining images of the Blitz, I think, forever since linked in the public consciousness with those words of Churchill, is that image of the dome of St Paul's, standing as the bombs fell and the fires raged all around it. Churchill and this cathedral church became united as icons for a moment in time that Churchill called the finest hour. Though I think we have to remember that when reflecting on those terrible days, we should pause to remember the words of Churchill's private secretary, John Martin. He was prepared to admit that while, with the luxury of hindsight, they may have formed the finest hour, that was not how they'd seemed at the time. Then they had been a time of agony piled on agony. And I think it's difficult, as we sit here today, surrounded by the new London cityscape, to picture the enormity of what happened here 85 years ago. Because commencing on Saturday, the 7th of September 1940, the bombers of the Luftwaffe returned for the next 56 consecutive nights, and for 75 nights, excepting only the 2nd of November 1940. No modern city had ever suffered such a concentrated and sustained assault from the air. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children lost life and limb in the wartime bombing of London and other major cities. More than 1 million homes were destroyed. In such a moment, people needed beacons of hope, both religious and secular. They needed the reassurance that their struggle was worthwhile, and in their different ways, that is what Churchill's oratory and St Paul's presence provided. The cathedral was, of course, also a natural setting for services that marked the milestones of the Second World War. In the spring of 1945, Churchill found himself attending 2 major services at the cathedral within the space of a month. At the first, on the 17th of April, the British Prime Minister wept openly at the memorial service for his friend and fellow Allied leader, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At the second, on the 12th of May 1945, he gave thanks for the end of the war in Europe. He also, of course, visited St Paul's School repeatedly in 1944, where Montgomery had his headquarters in the run-up to D-Day. There's no doubt that it is Churchill's wartime premiership that earned him his state funeral here in 1965. And that service served as the final act in a drama that starts in 1940, in which Churchill was the principal actor and for which St Paul's provided a suitably resonant backdrop. But before we turn to that final act, I want to talk just a little bit about Churchill's wider interactions with this place, both before and after 1940, and to show how it fitted into his mindset and into his worldview. So, I'm afraid I cannot claim that this place was a source of great personal religious solace and worship for Churchill. Despite his knowledge of the King James Bible and his ability to lace his speeches and writings with religious language and imagery, Winston Churchill does not appear to have been a conventionally religious individual. Perhaps one of the most moving and revealing statements of Churchill's beliefs that we have in the archives is a letter that he wrote out for Clementine in 1915. Clementine was his wife. And it's a letter to be opened in the event of his death. He wrote it because he thought he was going to be sent on a dangerous political mission to Gallipoli to see at first hand the progress of the Dardanelles campaign, a campaign for which he'd been the leading advocate in cabinet and which had already led to his dismissal as First Lord of the Admiralty. But when that mission didn't happen, his letter to Clementine was almost certainly kept unopened in case of his demise in the trenches, where he briefly commanded a battalion of Royal Scots Fusiliers for the first few months of 1916. And this letter was kept by Clementine. It survives in her papers. And in it, after detailing his wishes regarding his finances and his papers, he turns to higher things. And the letter concludes, remember this is to be opened in the event of his death, "Do not grieve for me too much. I am a spirit, confident of my rights. Death is only an incident, and not the most important, which happens to us in this state of being. On the whole, especially since I met you, my darling one, I have been happy, and you have taught me how noble a woman's heart can be. If there is anywhere else, I shall be on the lookout for you. Meanwhile, look forward, feel free, rejoice in life, cherish the children, guard my memory. God bless you." Now, as touched upon earlier, he certainly had a providential belief in his own destiny. As a young politician in the Edwardian era, he famously told Violet Asquith, the Prime Minister's daughter, at an Edwardian dinner party, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." And when writing his history of the Second World War, he would famously describe his assumption of the premiership in May 1940 as being like walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. While his final recorded advice to his cabinet on leaving office for the last time in April 1955 was simply, "Man is spirit." There are certainly light-hearted quotations attributed to him about meeting God, such as, "I am prepared to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." Or, when talking about heaven, "After I've been there a while, the good Lord will have to form a government, and he will certainly call upon me." He also wrote that when he got to heaven, he was going to spend a considerable portion of his first 1,000,000 years painting, because, of course, painting was his great hobby, his source of solace and relaxation. Though, forgive me for this, Dean, he was also prepared to invoke the other side. When called upon by his private secretary, Jock Colville, to explain his support for Soviet Russia in 1941, he did it with the justification that if Hitler invaded hell, then I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Overall, however, Churchill does not seem to have been given to detailed introspections about his spiritual life. He described how, as a young boy, "I always had to go once a week to church, and accumulated in those years so fine a surplus in the bank of observance that I've been drawing confidently upon it ever since." He credited his nanny, Mrs. Everest, with instilling in him low church values that caused him to resent the more elaborate ceremonial of his Victorian boarding schools. Indeed, as a young soldier serving in India, he admitted to passing through a violent and aggressive anti-religious phase, which, had it lasted, might easily have made me a nuisance. He does appear to have mellowed with adulthood, marrying at St Margaret's Church in Westminster in 1908 and attending services throughout his career when it was politic or necessary to do so. In his autobiographical work, My Early Life, written in 1930 at the age of 55, he described how he adopted quite early in life a system of believing whatever I wanted to believe, while at the same time leaving reason to pursue unfettered whatever paths she was capable of treading. And his private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, recalled him declaring, "I am not a pillar of the church, but a buttress. I support it from the outside." Which seems to capture his attitude to organized religion very well. Montague Brown suggested Churchill was an optimistic agnostic. Winston's wife, Clementine, appears to have been more conventionally religious, as was their daughter Mary. But as a buttress, he did have an historical belief in the importance of Christendom and a political belief in the value of Christian civilization, albeit one that was tied to a worldview that saw such civilization as moving forward through Victorian paternalism at home and through empire overseas. It was certainly a belief system that provided him with the tools he needed to frame his wartime alliance with the United States in terms of a shared Christian heritage. So speaking about the Atlantic Charter Declaration on Sunday, the 24th of August, 1941, he deliberately invoked the divine service that he'd held with President Roosevelt on board HMS Prince of Wales exactly 2 weeks before in Newfoundland Bay. And he, in a speech which used biblical language to denounce the barbaric fury of the Nazis, he described Hitler as a devil, contrasted this with his conviction that we had the chance to play our part in a great design, the end of which no mortal can foresee, and in which we had the right to feel that we were serving a cause for the sake of which a trumpet has sounded from on high. He described the Atlantic meeting as symbolizing the marshalling of the good forces of the world against the evil forces, which are now so formidable and triumphant and which have cast their cruel spell over the whole of Europe and a large part of Asia. His worldview was underpinned by an understanding of history that was based on the progress of the English-speaking peoples, and in which, of course, the Protestant Church had played a key role. Writing of the Reformation and his history of the English-speaking peoples, he noted how 6 copies of the English Bible had been set up here in St Paul's, and how multitudes thronged the cathedral all day to read them, especially, we are told, when they could get any person that had an audible voice to read aloud. He would have liked that bit. Having played as a child in the grounds of his paternal grandfather's house at Blenheim Palace, designed in the early 18th century by Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, he must have identified with Wren's architecture. And when writing of the Great Fire of London, he described how from the ashes of the old cathedral rose the splendid dome of St Paul's as it stands today. Because, of course, to Churchill, history was a living thing, a continuum, which was encapsulated by the memorials that surround us here at St Paul's. His was a history of great men, great deeds, and great literature, and he wrote about and identified with the writers, artists, politicians, and military figures commemorated in this place. He also played a role in adding to the fabric, his longevity ensuring that many of his friends and colleagues were commemorated on the walls of the cathedral during his lifetime, and with his involvement. Prominent among his great contemporaries was T.E. Lawrence, the celebrated Lawrence of Arabia, who advised Churchill, when Churchill was Secretary of State for the Colonies, on Middle Eastern affairs in 1921, and became a personal friend. When Lawrence died in that motorcycle accident in 1935, Churchill was one of the donors and signatories to the appeal fund that raised the money for the memorial bust by Kennington in this cathedral, and which Paula helped me find a little while ago. In the post-war period, after 1945, he was thrice called upon to unveil memorials within St Paul's to personal friends and colleagues. For Admiral of the Fleet Lord Keyes in 1950, for the newspaper magnate Lord Camrose in 1956, and for General Sir Ian Hamilton in 1957. And between them, I think those 3 men, Hamilton, Keyes, and Camrose, illustrate the range of Churchill's contacts and interests, capturing the broad historical sweep of his career. Churchill was a man who began life as a soldier and became a journalist, an author, a painter, a politician, and a statesman. He first met Ian Hamilton when he was a young cavalry officer, serving on the Indian Northwest frontier in 1897, and he later served under Hamilton in South Africa during the Second Boer War, writing up and publishing their exploits in his book entitled Ian Hamilton's March. And it was through such military adventures that the young Lieutenant Churchill first made his name, recording his adventures in a series of newspaper articles and books that were well received by the public, if not always by his military superiors. It also, of course, fell to Hamilton to command Allied ground forces at Gallipoli in 1915, the disastrous campaign that came out of Churchill's advocacy of attacking the Turks in the Dardanelles, a campaign which, as I've already said, nearly destroyed Winston's career, costing him his job as First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War. In his address at the unveiling of Hamilton's memorial in the crypt here, it seems particularly appropriate that Churchill paid tribute to his friend's own military memoirs, writing that he, Hamilton, described some of those days himself in the most lively and readable, though characteristically modest words. Well, Churchill's words were not always so modest. This, after all, is the man who stood up in the House of Commons after the Second World War and said that he thought it would be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as he proposed to write that history himself, which he certainly did. Of Roger Keyes, with whom Churchill had first worked on the reform of the Royal Navy before the First World War, Churchill said at the unveiling of the memorial, he, Keyes, was always in the van of naval progress and stimulated the tactical development of the destroyer flotillas, of our submarines, and most of all, of the fleet air arm. His exploits afloat and ashore will always excite the enthusiasm of the youth of Britain. The fleet air arm, precursor of the Royal Air Force, was as much the brainchild of Churchill, and one in which he actively participated, learning to fly in 1913, when, if you think about it, is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. You're only about 10 years after the Wright brothers. It's easy to forget that Churchill's ministerial career began in that Edwardian era. Between 1908 and 1915, he served in 3 of the senior offices of state: President of the Board of Trade, Home Secretary, and First Lord of the Admiralty. Keyes also played a vital role in the dramatic events that led to Churchill becoming wartime Prime Minister in May 1940, when he turned up in full Admiral's uniform in the House of Commons to attack Neville Chamberlain in the debate over the Norwegian campaign, the debate that ultimately led to Chamberlain's resignation. On unveiling the memorial to Lord Camrose, the former managing editor and chairman of the Daily Telegraph, Churchill declared, "In dark and uncertain times, no man could be more steady and persevering. During the war, his unfaltering confidence helped to sustain all those who knew him." Of course, it had been Lord Camrose who provided Churchill with the press platform to oppose the appeasement of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, at a time when many felt that his political career was over. It was also Camrose who helped assemble the group of wealthy benefactors that bought Chartwell, Sir Winston's house in Kent. They bought it from Winston and Clementine after the war and presented it to the National Trust on condition that the Churchills could continue living there for as long as they wanted, thereby removing a huge financial burden from them. And though Churchill is buried in St Martin's churchyard at Blaydon in Oxfordshire, alongside his parents, his brother, his wife and children, and within sight of his birthplace at Blenheim Palace, it's right, I think, that he's remembered in this cathedral, alongside such friends and contemporaries, as well as beside many of his own historical heroes. And of course, he's remembered primarily by means of the wonderful Churchill memorial screen, which is located in the crypt besides the remains of Nelson and Wellington. Designed by master blacksmith James Horrobin in his Somerset forge, the memorial screen was commissioned by the chapter here at St Paul's. It consists of a pair of centre gates and 2 smaller gates, and is decorated with wonderful bronze reminders of Churchill's awards, among them the Order of the Garter, the Order of Merit, and the Shield of the Warden of the Cinque Ports. The screen was dedicated in November 2004 for the 130th anniversary of Winston's birth. And of course, what unites Nelson, Wellington, and Churchill in death is that they all had state funerals here at St Paul's. It was Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II who decreed that Churchill should have a state funeral, and the serious planning actually began as early as January 1958. It was codenamed Operation Hope Not, and the arrangements were regularly reviewed and updated, right up to the time of Sir Winston's death, aged 90, a full 7 years later in January 1965. And I think it's worth just dwelling on this iconic moment, which brings together Churchill and this cathedral once again, placing them front and centre on the world stage. So let me take you back to January 1965. Pope-smoking Harold Wilson is the Prime Minister. The cost of an average house in the UK is just £3,500. A gallon of petrol is 5 shillings or 26 new pence. MPs have just voted to abolish the death penalty, though that hasn't yet become law. Donald Campbell has just set the world water speed record in Australia at 276.33 miles per hour. The notorious Cray twins have just been arrested for racketeering. And the Moody Blues are at the top of the hit parade with their single Go Now. And Sir Winston Churchill has died. He dies at his London home, 28 Hyde Park Gate, surrounded by his family, on the 24th of January 1965. Bizarrely, 24th of January 1965 is 70 years to the day after the death of his own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who died on the 24th of January 1895. And that convinced Churchill's private secretary, Jock Colville, and others that actually this was the last great manifestation of that Churchill will or spirit, that he hung on and chose to die on that day. We will never know. Afterwards, he lay in state in Westminster Hall for 3 days, while over 321,000 people came to queue at all hours in the bitter cold and pay their last respects. Then came the funeral here on the 30th of January 1965. And Churchill's state funeral, like Kennedy's assassination, is one of those historical moments that people tend to remember. Unlike Kennedy's, it's not unexpected. It's not particularly tragic. Churchill had lived a very long and full life. But like Kennedy's, it did somehow capture the moment. To many, I think it epitomized the passing of the baton from the wartime generation, symbolizing the end of Churchill's Britain, the Britain of empire, of Britannia ruling the waves, of heavy industry and world power status. But it also looked forward, because it highlighted the power of new technology, because this was one of the first great televised occasions. Indeed, it was viewed by a staggering 350 million viewers around the world, which was then 1/10 of the global population. Of course, there were only a couple of channels in the UK, and it was on both of them. But even so, those are figures that Simon Cowell would die for. What would Churchill have made of it all? I think he would have liked this combination of pageantry, tradition, and modernity. Because here was a man who was born into the Victorian era, but who lived to preside over the atomic age, and to combine a love of history with an interest in science and technology. The one recorded wish for his funeral was that there should be military bands. Well, he got 9. On the day of the funeral itself, Saturday the 30th of January 1965, Churchill's coffin was pulled through the crowded city streets on a gun carriage by sailors, accompanied by a military parade forming a procession 1 mile long. On arrival here at the Cathedral, his coffin was carried up the steps outside by a specially chosen company of Grenadier Guardsmen. The ceremonial pallbearers, who met it on the steps and walked before it, were comprised largely of the inner circle, the surviving inner circle, from his wartime administration. From the ranks of the politicians came Clement Attlee, Anthony Eden, and Harold Macmillan, all of whom had served as Prime Minister. From the Free Armed Services were Lord Ismay, Churchill's former Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Lord Slim, former commander of the British armies in Burma, Air Chief Marshal Lord Portal, Field Marshal Lord Alexander, and Admiral Earl Mountbatten. So frail was Clement Attlee that he had to pause on his way up the steps, thereby causing the guardsmen behind him to have to stop and almost stumble with the heavy lead-lined oak coffin. It was an anxious moment in an otherwise superbly choreographed event. To Mary Soames, Churchill's daughter, entering the shining vastness of St Paul's, there seemed to stretch before us a limitless vista of pale blue carpet. And somewhere beneath the shimmering cupola, the piercingly beautiful voices of the choir sang the words that dignify and lend hope to the humblest as to the greatest of funerals. I am the resurrection and the life. Other old wartime colleagues, General de Gaulle and former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, were present and standing with British and European royalty, including Her Majesty the Queen, who'd broken with tradition and precedent and taken to her pew before the coffin in a personal tribute to her most famous subject. Once inside, the service included the hymn, "Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory of the Coming of the Lord," better known, of course, as the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which served to emphasize both Churchill's maternal American ancestry, his mother had been born in Brooklyn, New York, and his consistent belief in Anglo-American unity. It's perhaps worth remembering, maybe especially today, that he is credited with coining and popularizing the phrase special relationship. And it was at this moment in the service, and it would be wonderful if this happened now, but it was at this moment in the service that a shaft of bright light pierced the otherwise grey sky and shone down from the dome, temporarily illuminating Churchill's coffin. Afterwards, he was carried out and taken down to the river, where his coffin was transported down the Thames on the Port of London Authority launch Haven Gore to Waterloo, and thence by train to his burial at Blaydon. To Clementine, his wife, at the end of that long day, it wasn't a funeral, it was a triumph. And that was in large part down to this setting. There could be no more fitting venue for Sir Winston's state funeral, because like Churchill himself, St Paul's Cathedral had defied the Blitz and had stood as a beacon of hope in the darkest days of the Second World War. And that comparison was not lost on contemporaries. For Oliver Littleton, now ennobled as Lord Chandos, who'd survived that bombing of Downing Street in October 1940, the funeral in January 1965 evoked vivid recollections. He wrote, "In my imagination, I saw again, it was 1941, from a rooftop. St. Paul standing out against the red, unearthly light of the clouds and the flames around it. Would anything be left? Today we know the answer. The noble building has lived and is one of the monuments, ere perennius, more lasting than bronze, to the man who brought to life the native unity and the invincible courage of the island race." And then there are these extracts from Sarah Churchill, Winston's daughter's moving, almost poetic recollections of the funeral. And these come from her memoir, A Thread in the Tapestry, which was published just 2 years after the funeral in 1967. And she wrote, "Now we were nearing St. Paul's Cathedral. I remembered seeing it silhouetted in flames from the roof of the Savoy, standing by my father's side all those years ago." And she goes on to describe how the Battle Hymn of the Republic crashed through the great cathedral as the bombs had crashed around it in 1940. But it's her final reflections that I find most moving, much more personal. She wrote, "Ghosts, they only live in our desire. It is perhaps our memories that see the mist hover over the lake and the fireflies dance where no human could. He is gone. A barge did come and carry him on. The steel cranes bowed their heads. The gold-grey sky held, and the Thames ran softly on. He is gone. What is mortal of him lies at Blaydon." Well, perhaps his spirit is enjoying playing with the celestial color palette. But I want to end by suggesting that he would be pleased to be remembered in this place. It's a place he knew, a place he wrote about, and a place which features memorials to many of his contemporaries. And it is a place in which he is forever linked, and with which he is forever linked, by 2 moments in time, 1940 and 1965. Thank you.
Well done. Alan, thank you so much, and we'll give you a moment to refresh yourself, rehydrate after that Wonderful, wonderful lecture. People have been sending in their questions, so we'll start to think about that. And then just to remind you, either use the QR code or put in the code yourself, or if you are using a quill pen, please just write on your brochure and hold it up in the air, and somebody will come and pick it up. I'd just like to start with a question from me about when Ray was preaching, he used that very famous phrase about this is none other than a battle for Christian Europe and for the future of a civilization. And I was trying to tie that together with your very vivid expression about he wasn't a pillar of the church, he was a buttress supporting from the outside, which I hadn't heard, and I really liked that. Do you think that was really what he was talking about? Or do you think it was his progressive view of history, which I think did see the Reformation and a very Protestant view as being core to Europe? Was it more about that?
I think it's certainly about that. I mean, it go back to what I said in my talk, is that he views history very much as a continuum. I mean, after all, this is someone who spends some of his early formative years in his grandparents' home at Blenheim Palace. So he's brought up sort of surrounded by portraits and tapestries of his illustrious ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. And of course, you know, Marlborough had been credited with, well, did lead a European coalition to victory against a European despot in the early 18th century, winning a series of stunning victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde. Churchill is sort of brought up with that. And I think he feels his lineage very strongly. He feels this sense of history. And I think he certainly, you know, he's born into the highest echelons of Victorian society at the very height of the British Empire. And that, I think, colours his whole approach. And certainly he does, although not conventionally religious, he certainly repeatedly talks about Christendom and what he sees as the sort of the values of Christendom. And I think that's what he's seeking to defend and to buttress.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So this is a question about rhetoric. So in two parts, has there been a politician since Churchill to rival his rhetoric? And if somebody wanted to learn to speak as powerfully as Churchill did, do you have any tips from studying his archives?
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing about Churchill's oratory is that it doesn't come naturally to him. People tend to assume this. They tend to think of him as a great orator, and of course he was a great orator. But actually it was something that he had to work very hard at. He had a speech defect, which causes him to lisp and not to be able to say the letter S properly. And if you look at some of the early letters that he writes, particularly to his mother, when he's thinking of going into politics, one of the things that he's concerned about is whether or not actually he is going to be able to become an orator. And it's one of the things that he's nervous about. He makes his name, as I said in my talk early on, as a writer, first and foremost. His strategy between 1895 and 1900 as a young soldier is to make a name for himself, because he's already decided that he wants to go into politics. In order to get into politics, he needs two things. He needs fame and fortune. How is he going to get that? His strategy is to get himself transferred to as many dangerous places as possible and to write up his exploits as newspaper articles and then books. So he starts as a writer, and he's clearly a very gifted writer. By the time you get to the Second Boer War, he's a very highly paid war correspondent, and he's already published, as he put it, as many books as Moses. So he establishes himself, first of all, as a writer, but I don't think he knows whether or not that is going to translate over into oratory. So he has to think about how he's going to develop his rhetoric. And he actually writes a really interesting article as a young man of 22. He's in India, he's in the army, he's thinking about a political career, and he writes an essay, one of the few things that he never published in his lifetime, called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, in which he actually looks at what makes a good public orator. And you can literally see Churchill in this essay trying to identify what makes for a good public speech, and setting out the various things that he should be trying to do, trying to find a distinctive voice, building to a dramatic ending, making sure that you are as convinced as your audience of what you're talking about. And he sets out what he thinks makes a good orator. So you can see him educating himself and thinking about this. And then I think, in answer to your question, if I was to give anyone a tip on this, I would say come to Churchill Archive Centre, come to Churchill College, look at those speech notes and look at how he does it. Because the way he sets it out on the page in this poetic phrasing is clearly incredibly helpful to him. It gives him the rhythm, it gives him the pauses, it gives him the emphasis. Also, by setting it out on the page in a blank verse format, you make it very easy to pick up the next passage if you've gone wrong, if you've lost your place. Churchill had a very good memory. There's no doubt that with major speeches, large parts of it would have been committed to memory. But he made a point of always having very full notes for important speeches. Sometimes even the things that when you hear the speech sound as if they're ad-libs, when you go back to the notes, you'll find them there. So for example, when he's speaking at MIT in 1949, when you listen to the speech, he goes to say internal combustion engine and says infernal combustion engine, and it gets a laugh from the audience. But then you go back to the speech notes, and that joke's actually written in. He's prepared it that way to sound like that. So preparation, he does prepare extremely thoroughly. Yeah. As to other orators, I don't know. I think what Churchill shows you is the advantage of writing in your own voice. He doesn't have a team of speechwriters in the sense that a modern politician would have. That's not to say that people aren't feeding him information. Of course they are. He's gathering information from all the departments. He will also show drafts of his speeches to key people whom he trusts, including Clementine, to get their view. He won't always listen to what they say, but he will seek advice on his speeches. But the basic voice is his. He takes the information. He does the same thing with his writing. He takes the information that is prepared by others, and then he puts it into the distinctive Churchillian voice. So have there been other orators in the sort of modern era who have been able to see that? Well, in Churchill's era, of course, David Lloyd George was a very famous orator, and perhaps one who could maybe ad-lib better than Churchill could. Churchill's friend, Lord Birkenhead, had a reputation as a great orator. More recently, perhaps Barack Obama, before he was constrained by the White House machine. I don't know.
Wonderful. Thank you. A very, very brief one about the archives, just because you mentioned that a researcher could go, and then something about his political aspirations. So on the archives, are all the Churchill papers, diaries, letters available online, or is it only open to researchers?
Okay. Well, so the first thing to say is that the Churchill Archive Centre was built in 1973, purpose-built to house Churchill's papers. They weren't all owned for the nation at that point. We had to wait a little while for that. But the centre was built to house his papers. but we've also been able to collect around him, as you mentioned in your introduction, the papers of others, people who worked with him, for him, sometimes against him. So there is a huge body of material for the study of Churchill and his era that's been assembled under one roof. The Archive Centre is open to anyone who wants to come and use it. We're not an ivory tower locked away within Churchill College, within the University of Cambridge. Anyone can make an appointment to come and do research in the Archive Centre. So Winston Churchill's own personal papers, 2,500 boxes, or 2,336 boxes to be precise,
Wow.
have been digitised. And that's been done working with the academic publishers Bloomsbury. So Bloomsbury, of course, are the publishers that brought you Harry Potter. So they've reinvested their Harry Potter gains in Winston Churchill. And they've produced a digital edition of the Churchill Archive online, which they sell to other universities and institutions around the world. So the Churchill papers are available in multiple places, but they are always free at the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge, and anyone can come and look at them online there. And we also operate a free digital copying service. So if someone can't get to the Archive Centre and they're interested in Churchill's correspondence with a particular individual or around a particular subject, they can email us and we can digitize those files and send them to you. Obviously, there are limits on that service. So at the moment, it's up to an hour's free copying per researcher per month.
Great. So just going to his political aspirations. Did Churchill have aspirations to become Prime Minister before he was chosen? Maybe you can talk about the nature of his ambition, which you touched on. Or was it because of the beginnings of the conditions of World War II that he sought the office?
I think I would refer you back to the line I quoted from that Edwardian dinner party. We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm. I think Churchill was always going to be Prime Minister if he could be. He decided after his father's death that he wanted to go into politics. I think his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, dies in January 1895 at the age of just 45. And Winston Churchill is only 20 at this point. He's just got into the army. But I think that is a catalyst moment for Churchill. For two reasons. I think first of all, his father dies before he's had a chance to prove himself to his father. And as many of you will know, their relationship had not been the easiest one. Lord Randolph Churchill had been very critical of his eldest son, and several very critical letters survive in the archive. He'd predicted that his son might just become a mere social wastrel. He'd sent him into the army rather than sending him to university because they didn't feel he was bright enough to go to university. So someone who becomes Prime Minister twice and wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. But, so he had this uneasy relationship with his father, but then his father dies before he's had a chance to prove himself. And I think that has a profound impact on him. The one other essay that Churchill writes in his lifetime and doesn't publish is a piece called The Dream, that he writes in, I think, 1947, just after the Second World War. And in that essay, The Dream, he describes or imagines a scene where he's sitting in his painting studio at Chartwell, touching up a portrait of his father, when suddenly his father's ghost appears in the chair opposite him. And the two of them have a conversation about all the things that have happened since 1895 and since his father's death. 2 horrendous world wars, women getting the vote, all of these things. And then, of course, the father's ghost disappears in a puff of cigarette smoke before Churchill has had a chance to tell his father what he's achieved. And the ghost's parting words are something like, "When I see you here, I'm surprised you didn't go into politics. You might have made a name for yourself." And I think that's quite revealing about what drove Churchill as a young man. He wants to get into Parliament. He takes up his father's causes. He dresses like his father. He writes the biography of his father. He's trying to prove himself to his father's memory. But of course, the other side of that is, had his father lived, it would have been very difficult for him to go into politics at all, because he would have been under his father's shadow. So it's that strange sort of liberating moment, but
yes.
one that he clearly feels a certain amount of guilt about. But that's a long way of coming back to your original question, which is to say, did Churchill want to become Prime Minister? Yes, I think he was always ambitious. He was always looking for that opportunity if he could get it. And certainly when you get to the 1930s and he's out of office and in his wilderness years, there are letters to Clementine where he talks about the fact that it doesn't look as though I'm going to be able to get to the highest office, therefore I may think about leaving politics.
Gosh. So thank you. Let's just talk about his legacy in terms of, there are multiple films and also the rhetoric that's used. We talk about Churchillian language. So there's a question here which is about how might Churchill's legacy inform and shape a positive future for our nation, thinking that quite a lot of the groups that reach for Churchill actually have a particular view of history and what the nation should look like.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's a really difficult question to answer, actually. Not least, of course, because Churchill had a very long career and was actually a very complicated person who didn't always hold sort of consistent views. And he was quite open about that. He said he quite often in his life had to eat his words, and on the whole, he'd found it a wholesome diet. So, I mean, are you talking about the Churchill of the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, or the 1950s? There are differences. And I think it's interesting to look at the way Churchill is seen in this country compared perhaps to the way he's seen in the United States, and what that tells you. I mean, generally in the United States, I think Churchill is seen as an incredibly a force for good on the world stage, and an uncontested, uncontroversial one, which is hopefully helping Keir Starmer in his conversations today. And in the United States, it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. One of the things that President Clinton and President George W. Bush would agree on would be their admiration for Winston Churchill. In this country, I think he now has a much more complex legacy. But in a way, that's not surprising, because, of course, what the Americans don't see is the very long domestic career. So they are only thinking of Churchill, when they think of Churchill, really about two moments on the world stage. And the first would be 1940 and the stand against fascism, and the second would be 1946, the Iron Curtain speech and the warnings about communism. Whereas in this country, of course, Churchill comes with a much longer and more complicated domestic political record. So if you come from sort of South Wales mining communities, your views of Churchill are likely to be coloured by his sort of roles as Home Secretary. And of course, you now have the debates over empire and race and his views on those. So I think Churchill's legacy in the UK is a complex, contested one to some extent at the moment, but you still can't get away, I think, from the fact that in 1940, he makes an incredible difference, both for this country and on the world stage, for the reasons that were given in the sermon, that without Britain as part of the war in 1940, you cannot have D-Day, and therefore you're not going to get to VE Day and VJ Day as quickly. So Churchill's supreme achievement, an incredibly brave achievement, is to take on that office in May 1940. and to promise victory at a time when victory seemed incredibly unlikely, and to lead the country through 5 years of war and hardship to achieve that. And of course, we know that the Prime Minister in May 1940 had to be a Conservative, even though they would be leading a national coalition government, because the Conservatives were still the biggest party in the House of Commons. And the real alternative to Churchill at that point was Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. And we know that Lord Halifax's views were very different from Churchill's, and that he was inclined to try and seek a diplomatic solution to the conflict if he could. So I think if you look at Churchill's legacy, the Churchill that is remembered in Churchill College, in the Churchill War Rooms, at Chartwell, is the Churchill of 1940, really. And I don't think you can take that achievement away from him.
No. Thank you. Just turning to the cathedral here while we're sat here, I'm afraid I couldn't arrange for the sunbeam to come down and illumine the under the dome there, but one of the things that we live with constantly is being in a capital city where sight lines get compromised and this sort of thing, and you probably are aware that there's quite a lot of legal protection for St Paul's, for views. So if you go down to Richmond Park, 12 miles away, there's a protected view that you can actually see from Richmond Park, a direct view to the dome of St Paul's. You go up onto Primrose Hill, the same sort of thing. But in Churchill's time, of course, St Paul's was the tallest building in London. And I've often wondered about that, as well as the kind of the symbol of resilience. So you mentioned about Hawksmoor, Blenheim Palace. What do you think it was about the building itself, rather than necessarily the religious institution, just physically the building, which was so important for him?
I think that's fairly easy to answer. I think the building represented to him the history and the London that he was fighting for. I mean, it was a very visual symbol of London. And it's one that could, as you say, be seen at that time from all over the city. So, I referred to the account by Oliver Littleton. I mentioned the account by Sarah Churchill. They both independently describe moments when they were sort of standing on balconies or on roofs, looking out across the cityscape as the fires were raging and the bombs were falling, and seeing St Paul's there. And seeing St Paul's standing, I think, was a visual symbol for all of them of what they were fighting for.
So just to sort of wind that on, you talked about the way he had overseen, curated, opened a number of memorials for dear friends and colleagues. How do you think he would have felt about the set of gates that were done in his memory, is the question. Would he have been pleased with them, or would he have preferred a statue like Wellington, or a plaque maybe?
I'd say, it's a great question. Again, how can we know? How can we be sure? What we do know, I think, is that he liked sculptures of himself, but he liked some more than others. He was a particular admirer of the work of Oscar Niemann. And he got to know Niemann very well, and they worked together on a number of Churchill busts and sculptures in the post-war period, including the one not far from here in the Guildhall, but also the one inside the lobby of the House of Commons. And when you look at the Niemann sculptures, I think you can see why Churchill liked them. Because Niemann portrays him as this sort of very imposing figure, sort of rising out of the granite or rising out of the bronze. This is Churchill as he wants to be seen, as opposed, of course, to the famous Sutherland portrait, which is Churchill as he didn't want to be seen. So, I mean, who can be sure? I think he would... a Neiman sculpture or a Neiman bust, I suspect, might have been his preference. It would have been interesting to get his thoughts on where that was placed in the crypt relative to the other individuals whom he'd known and worked alongside and in some cases competed against.
Yeah, wonderful. I have to say I have a lovely connection both here, but also I was rector of St Margaret's Church at an earlier stage, and at the back of the abbey, the west end of the abbey, there's the Churchill Memorial, and Mary Soames used to come on his birthday or on special days and lay a wreath in his honour before her death in 2014. So from your descriptions, it seems that Churchill had a very good sense of humour. To what extent does this come out in the archives or in his career? And was it a kind of protection mechanism, or was it something that he crafted and honed, like his rhetorical skills?
Again, great question. I think... I suspect that the humour is always there, but that it becomes more crafted and more honed as his oratory develops and also as his confidence increases and his experience increases. I mean, the sad thing with the archives, of course, is that a lot of these things are not written down. So you don't find them not surprisingly, you don't find them in the cabinet papers or in the private office telegrams. But a lot of times you will find them in the memoirs and the letters of the people around him. Of course, unfortunately, some of them are apocryphal. I think there is a tendency with great lines to want to think that great people have said them. And I'll give you an example of this. So here is an exchange that some of you may have heard between George Bernard Shaw and Winston Churchill. Of course, they did know one another, they did correspond regularly. But George Bernard Shaw is supposed to have written to Churchill, informing him that he had a new play opening. Here's 2 tickets for the first night, bring a friend if you have one. To which Churchill is supposed to have responded, can't come on the first night, will come on the second if there is one. And everyone wants to believe that's Winston Churchill. Unfortunately, what I found in the archive was a letter from a young journalist, a man called Derek Tatham, who writes to George Bernard Shaw and asks if he can use this exchange for a radio program that he's doing. And George Bernard Shaw writes back, seemingly quite angry, and says, this is a terrible slur, it didn't happen. Tatham does the only thing he can do, which is to write to Churchill, and Churchill replies simply, I agree with Mr. Shaw. So sometimes we have to disillusion people. Fortunately, there are enough of these genuine Churchill anecdotes to, I think, prove that he did have a very good sense of humour. One of my favourites, letters that does survive in the archive, if I may, is a letter that he writes to the Duke of Devonshire, who's the president of the Royal London Zoological Society in 1943. And the London Zoological Society has just presented Churchill with a lion. And it is a living lion, a lion called Rota. Apparently still exists in stuffed form in a museum in Florida. But anyway, they write to Churchill offering him this lion, and Churchill writes back a wonderful letter to the Duke of Devonshire where he says, I have no problem in becoming the proud possessor of this lion as long as I don't have to feed it or keep it here at Downing Street. And as long as the zoo will look after it for me. But then he writes, however, these are hard times and the cabinet are fine at the moment, but they may become restless, in which case I will have much use of the lion.
Well, then maybe you can put me out of my misery, because I'm pretty sure that the line that Churchill said that St Paul's must be preserved at all costs is apocryphal.
I haven't been able to, obviously, if I'd been able to find it in a written document, I would have used it this evening.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it's apocryphal, and it may be that it's out there in some memoir somewhere, but I haven't been able to source it.
So just leading on, this is the penultimate question, so you can know you're in the downhill run. done. Was Churchill an honest historian? Because, of course, he was a very significant historian. Or did he have concerns about how people would judge him in the future, which caused him to embellish his own history?
Well, we're getting into very complicated territory here. Are any historians truly honest and truly objective? I would say the short answer to that question is no. He was a politician who was also historian who was a politician, and the two certainly sort of fade into one another and colour one another. When he's writing his works of history, his multi-volume histories, he works with very good teams of historians. He gets the very best minds of the day to supply him with the information that he needs. He's got literary assistants combing the archives. So, I mean, he's certainly sort of taking it seriously and gathering the information, but I think I would refer you back to the quote that I gave in the talk. Best to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself. And he certainly is writing with a view to posterity as well. And you can see that, a view to posterity, but also in some cases with a view to actually what's going on now. So an example of that is when he writes his multi-volume history of the Second World War. He's writing that between 1948 and 1954 at a time when he's still the leader of the opposition and then the prime minister. So he's still pursuing an active political career. And you can see in that book that there are certain issues which he's very careful over. So, for example, he's not, in the end, although he initially wants to be in the first draft, he cuts his criticism of Eisenhower and Eisenhower not going to Berlin because he knows that Eisenhower is about to become president, he's about to become prime minister again, and it's not going to work if he's just brought out a volume criticizing the American president. So, I mean, there's a great book by David Reynolds, Cambridge academic, called Churchill in Command of History, which looks at exactly this. It looks at how Churchill wrote his history of the Second World War and then compares it with actually what happened and goes back into the archive to look at what Churchill chooses to emphasize, what he chooses to leave out, and to look at the reasons why. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. It won the Wolfson History Prize, and it's like peeling an onion. It's what a history book should be.
Great. So very finally then, a light-hearted question to end with. After he'd said, "We shall fight them on the beaches," and the microphone was switched off, is it true that he then said, "And we shall hit them over the heads with bottles, as that is all we have"?
We don't have it in writing, but it does appear, I think, in various sort of memoirs of sort of people around him, that or equivalent statements that he made. And it sounds right. It's the sort of thing, I think, that he would have said. It's certainly the sort of mentality he's taking to it at that point.
Great. Well, Alan, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Great. Really good.